Thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop, and welcome everyone to this virtual presentation on 3D controllable image synthesis. This is joint work with my postdoc Yi and my PhD students Katja, Lars, and Michael. As we all know, there's two dominating paradigms in simultaneous localization and mapping. On the one hand, there are indirect approaches that take a set of input images, extract and describe key points, and match them in order to minimize reprojection errors for tracking the agent or for inferring the 3D landmark locations and building the map. And on the other hand, there are direct approaches, which also take a set of input images, but directly try to minimize photometric reconstruction errors in order to track the agent or estimate maps in terms of per pixel depth estimates. One work that I particularly like is the work from Davison et al. At CVPR 2013, where instead of a point-based scene representation, they consider a object-level scene description, which is much more rich semantically and also allows for much higher compression rates, so potentially allows the model to scale to much larger scenes. Now, one important point I'd like to make here is that current SLAM systems are mostly discriminative. They are large, sophisticated pipelines which are composed of different modules such as feature detection, robust matching, loop closure detection, and mapping that are either hand engineered or learned, but learned individually. Now, the question I want to raise here is, well, can we also build a generative model for SLAM? There has been a huge success recently in building generative models for images. So would a generative model for SLAM be useful? A generative model for SLAM would learn the observation manifold. It wouldn't require any supervision or any annotations. For instance, in the SLAM++ system, they required all of the objects to be pre-scanned using Kinect Fusion, and they also required pre-trained object detectors, for instance. Such generative models would also capture the uncertainty in the data, which is certainly useful for all processing tasks where there's a lot of uncertainty, such as in computer vision, and which also allows for making predictions and, for instance, for completing missing parts in the scene. But the big question, of course, is how can we solve this complicated, this challenging problem? And in particular, how can we disentangle the underlying 3D factors? And in this work, which you call 3D controllable image synthesis, we want to do first small baby steps towards this grand goal of computer vision. So, in a simplified, from a simplified viewpoint, the goal of this work is to generate an image given a scene description that includes a pose and the appearance and the camera viewpoint of the scene, which can be used directly for simulation and training downstream tasks, for instance, or for verification of intelligent systems such as safety critical systems like self-driving cars. However, of course, in terms of fidelity, we are still very far from scenes of that level of complexity. And these models could also be used in the Bayesian setting for estimating the latent properties given an image, such as for doing pose estimation or localization. So in brief, the goal of 3D controllable image synthesis, this is how we define the problem, is to learn a generative image model that can generate a scene composed of multiple objects, where the underlying 3D factors are controllable, where we have full control over the object shape, over the object pose, over the object appearance, and over the camera viewpoint, for instance. And where we learn all of this from 2D observations alone. We don't need, for instance, the pose of the input images, which is often not available. And we have also no other supervision, like semantic segmentation or depth maps or pose information. How do generative models look like today? So the simplest generative model is a traditional rendering pipeline where there is an artist that makes a 3D model of the scene, and that is then rendered using a physically based rendering algorithm. By design, in this pipeline, the 3D factors can be controlled because they have all been manually created and arranged. However, 3D content creation is of course very expensive, and this is not scalable. And furthermore, creating photorealistic content is still an unsolved problem. So ideally, we'd like to learn this process, this entire process, from images. Recently, there has been a great success in photorealistic, high-resolution image synthesis using generative adversarial networks, which learn to generate from a latent code that's sampled from a Gaussian distribution, a image like the one we see here on the right, using a set of 2D convolutions. The advantage of this model is that this allows for unsupervised learning from 2D images where there is no artist required for the generation process. But the disadvantage is, while some of the factors can actually be disentangled to some degree, the necessary 3D underlying factors can typically not be controlled. It's very difficult for such a 2D model to disentangle the physical image formation process. However, we do know the physical image formation process, so we should actually use this in our generative model, and that's exactly the idea for our approach. Instead of having just a 2D generator, we combine a 2D generator with a 3D generator. So we sample a latent code from a random distribution. Then we have a 3D generator that generates the parameters of such primitives together with the appearance of these primitives, which is then rendered using a neural rendering algorithm that's differentiable onto the 2D image plane for each object individually, as you can see here, and then composed together into the final image. The advantage of this approach is that the 3D factors can now be controlled. And at the same time, we can learn this model in a fully unsupervised fashion from 2D images, despite we can do this only for now for very simple scenes. So the key idea here is really to do joint 3D and 2D modeling. Here is an overview of the entire model, and I'd like to walk you now through this model step by step, starting on the left side with the 3D generator. The 3D generator takes a latent code drawn from a random distribution as input and produces the foreground and the background primitives in terms of their parameters. So O1 to ON are all the foreground objects, and OBG are the parameters that describe the background. Each of these primitives is represented by a pose RT, a 3D scale SI, and the appearance parameters of that object. I will leave the exact form of these primitives open for now, and we'll come back to these primitives in the experiment section because we use different primitives. We use points and cuboids and spheres and other sorts of primitives for our experimental evaluation. Now, given these generated primitives in 3D space, we use a differentiable rendering algorithm that renders a feature map, a alpha map that defines which pixel is actually part of the object and what is background or what should be transparent, as well as a depth map for each of these objects. For the background, it only defines the feature map because we assume the background is dense in the image. We then convert these features to RGB pixels using 2D convolutions. You can see here that from this feature map, we obtain a RGB representation of the car from this feature map, we get a RGBD representation of the car. And we also refine these very coarse alpha maps using these 2D convolutions to actually fit the shape of the car. And we also refine the depth maps. These are the variables denoted by prime here. And then we render all of these individual objects and the background using alpha composition from the furthest to the smallest depth value. Now let's have a look at the loss functions. We have 3 loss functions: an adversarial loss, a compactness loss, and a geometric loss. Let's first look at the adversarial loss. We denote the entire generative process, what is inside this box here, using g theta, indicated by this dotted arrow here. That maps from latent code C to the image I had. We use a standard adversarial loss which consists of a discriminator that tries to play this 2-player game, that tries to fool the generator and distinguish between images generated by the generator and real images. However, we notice that if we just have this upper part here, the model doesn't work as well because there's an ambiguity. It sometimes happens that the foreground object is actually merged into the background, because the background can well represent also the foreground object. So in order to prevent this, what we do is we also created not only a real image dataset, but a real background dataset by removing the foreground objects and just rendering the background. And we have this flag here which determines if the input to the discriminator should actually be compared to an image with foreground objects or just the background image. Now, having this real background image dataset and this flag in the discriminator now allows for distinguishing foreground and background and correctly puts all the object information into the object slots here. We also have a compactness loss that tries to minimize the area of the alpha map, that tries to minimize the size of the object, because otherwise the object is unconstrained, and again, parts of the object could be rendered as foreground that are actually part of the background. In order to do so, we simply minimize the expectation over the latent code C of the L1 norm of the alpha map to turn as many pixels as possible to black. And finally, we have a geometric consistency term that enforces 3D geometric consistency. Remember that we have these 2D convolutions, which means that after rendering, the 3D consistency might be violated because of this deformation through the 2D convolutions. So what we do here is we take a feature representation xi prime and compare it to the same feature representation after randomly transforming the object in 3D, rotating and translating the object, and warping it back according to the corresponding depth map. We always have the depth map, so we can always warp all the pixels back. So we can look at the object from multiple sides and make sure that these objects actually look consistent. And we do this for all the objects, for all the slots that we have, I1 to n, and we multiply with the alpha map to only consider pixels that are actually on the object for this loss. And we do this not only for the feature maps, but also for the depth map. We can also make sure that the geometry, not only the appearance, is actually consistent across multiple viewpoints. Okay, so let's look at some results. We used multiple data sets for our experiments. We used, on the one hand, a simple car dataset rendered without background. Then we used a car dataset with background. We used a rendered indoor datasets where we have CAD models superimposed on real background images. And we use a fruit dataset. This is a real dataset that we captured using a camera, where we put artificial food in front of random backgrounds in our lab. So here are our results. We compare to 2 baselines. First, we compare to layout to IM, which is a 2D only baseline. So it has only control over 2D translation. And it also requires 2D bounding box supervision. It's a form of an autoencoder where the appearance of the content of a bounding box is encoded and then composed into an entire image and decoded back into the image. However, we observed that this baseline fails to disentangle the object identity and the pose. If we try to synthesize a layout and then move the bounding box that has synthesized the layout, the object appearance will change completely, which is fine for the discriminator, of course, because it sees only individual images. It doesn't need to be consistent. But if we want to have a controllable model, it's of course undesirable if we move the object that the identity can completely switch from blue to yellow to red to gray. We also created a baseline from our approach by removing the 3D part. What we do here is we have the generator directly predicting 2D primitives in the form of 2D bounding boxes that are directly fed into these 2D conf layers here, these little units here. And this model uses the same adversarial loss as our full 3D model. Now, compared to our full 3D model, this only provides 2D translational control. And while the identity is not entangled with the translation, it fails to, of course, disentangle rotation and translation because it doesn't know anything about rotation in 3D. So if we move this object, as you can see here, then it also changes the rotation of the object. And here are some results from our approach, our full 3D model, where we have moved objects, in this case the blue object here, in 3D space, where we have rotated it. You can see that it rotates here without being moved. Or we rotate the entire scene by rotating the camera around the scene, or here changing the elevation angle in the last row of the camera. Let's have a look at these results in form of a video. Here we can see the synthetic car dataset, some training samples from that dataset. Note that we use only images as input to our method and don't require any 2D or 3D labels. As you can see, for the baseline, the identity switches if we translate the object. Our 2D baseline changes rotation when we translate the object. Now here's the results from our full model, where you can see that the identity is maintained when translating the object or rotating the object. Here we change the camera viewpoint. And here we change the elevation of the camera. Here are some results on the flying furniture indoor dataset, where the training samples are created by superimposing 3D CAD models on random backgrounds. Again, only images are input to our model. No 2D or 3D labels. Here are some results where the camera is rotated. And here are some results finally on the fruit dataset, where you can see translation of objects. To further analyze our model, we investigated what is actually a good 3D representation. We haven't talked much about the 3D representation, the primitive-based representation that was used before. So we tried to look at different representation and see which representation actually fits best. As a baseline, we always have the vanilla gun, the 2D gun, where we also can compute an FID score, but we cannot compute these other metrics. The FID-T metric and the FID-R metric are computed by, for the 3D controllable models, rotating the object and measuring the inception distance for the rotated and translated object. And FIDI is computed by looking at each object individually. So these metrics here basically quantify how well our model disentangles the 3D underlying factors. So what we compared first is a simple point cloud, a cuboid, and a sphere representation. For the point cloud, we rendered little 2D Gaussians into the image corresponding to the points and the size corresponding to the distance of the point. And in the feature channels, we encode the feature information for encoding the appearance of the object. Here you can see also in the second column the alpha map color-coded for the different object channels and also the final image that was produced. For the cuboid primitive, we predict in 3D the coordinates, the pose, and the shape of a 3D cuboid, of a 3D bounding box that we then render into the image, also using some smoothing. And then we have a sphere representation where we render spheres into the image, which can of course also be rotated and translated and scaled. Again, in the feature channels, we encode the appearance information. What we observe from this experiment is that all of them yield very similar FID scores. So it seems like the precise form of the 3D representation is less relevant than the general concept of joint 3D and 2D modeling. However, spheres perform slightly better as the others, as they don't suffer as much from surface discontinuities compared to the other representations. We also looked at what happens when we just use a single primitive, in this case a point-based representation, to represent the entire scene. Of course, the objects are not separatable anymore, so there's no separate control over each individual object anymore. However, the FID scores are a little bit lower even than for our object-based representation, because it's a bit easier for the model to learn only a single primitive. However, what we observed is that the number of objects now varies with respect to the viewpoint, because the model cannot distinguish different number of objects anymore. So we have, when we change, for instance, when we rotate the scene, can happen that like this red car here completely disappears. And finally, we also experimented with a standard differentiable rendering mesh-based representation where we don't have any 2D convolutions, but just use a textured mesh. So our 3D generator predicts the vertices and faces and the texture map of a mesh. And then we render that mesh to the image using differentiable rendering. However, of course, inferring a mesh using a deep neural network is not easy, which is also reflected by these numbers here, which indicate lower image fidelity, as you also can see here by the rendering on the right. Let's also look at some failure cases of our model. Well, first of all, the model works only on simplistic scenes, and a big challenge will of course be how to scale this to more realistic scenes and also to higher resolutions. But some failure cases that we observed on these simpler data sets are that in some cases multiple objects are represented by one primitive, as here when we move the banana and the orange together as a single primitive. Or the object identity may vary, as in this case where we rotate the camera by a large degree and this bench changes into a chair. We were wondering, well, I mean, it's great that we can get some factorized 3D representation of images in a completely unsupervised way, but we were not super happy by the complexity that we could handle, and also by the resolution that we could output, and by the quality of the models. So we're wondering, is there a better 3D representation for 3D controllable image synthesis? And indeed, there is a couple of baselines that have recently appeared, famously Hologun, that are producing images of single objects. So Hologun is a representation that uses a 3D voxelized feature representation that is then convolved by 3D convolutions and rotated into the viewpoint, and then convolved by more 2D convolutions, a neural rendering step, in order to yield the final image. What we observed is that Hologun leads to high image fidelity, as you can see from here, but the object identity may vary with the viewpoint due to the learnable projection. Right? So there is some 3D and some 2D convolutional layers followed after posing the 3D feature cube, which allows for changing not only the appearance but also changing the object shape or the viewpoint. This leads to an sort of entangled representation, in particular for extreme viewpoint changes, as also evidenced by our 3D reconstruction result. What we did here is basically we generated multiple images of the same object from different viewpoints and tried to reconstruct this back using a state-of-the-art 3D reconstruction pipeline. You can see that the reconstruction looks very noisy. Another representation that has recently been proposed for single image object synthesis is to directly have a 3D convolutional network that directly predicts the 3D object in terms of its colors, which are then rendered onto the image plane without any subsequent 2D convolutions that could potentially entangle the 3D factors again. And indeed, this leads to more multi-view consistent results, but because this is very difficult and can be done only at low image fidelity, or otherwise would require too much memory, the appearance that is rendered is, or the image fidelity that we obtain is typically not very high, which also reflects in the reconstruction results because it's more difficult to match features on this type of images. So what we did instead is we looked at a representation that has been recently proposed in the context of novel view synthesis, neural radiance fields, and try to build a generative model for neural radiance fields, which then become conditional neural radiance fields. You can see this here. We have a random code that we sample, and then we have this conditional radiance field G that takes this random code, a viewing direction D, and a 3D location X as input, and outputs a color value and a volume density at every 3D point in the scene, which can then be queried through a volumetric rendering, a differentiable volumetric renderer, in order to produce an image. And it turns out that these radiance fields are actually not only a useful representation for novel view synthesis, but also for generative models. So they lead to high quality reconstructions that can be queried at resolutions of 512 square pixel or even more. And when you reconstruct them using a reconstruction algorithm, you get much more consistent reconstructions. So this representation that we propose for generative model is multi-view consistent by default because we don't have any 2D convolutions. It's continuous, it can be queried at arbitrary precision, and therefore leads to high image fidelity with low memory consumption. So here's a short overview of our model. We have a generator and a discriminator, and key to making this work is our patch discriminator, which considers a dilated patch of size 32 by 32 pixel, where we randomly choose the scale and therefore the dilation factor during both for the generator and for the discriminator, to enable a efficient 2D convolutional network as the discriminator. What you can see here is that the input to this generator are the latent codes CS and CA for shape and appearance, as well as the camera matrix and the extrinsics. This is the camera pose, as well as the parameters of this patch. These are the position of this patch that should be generated. We don't generate the entire image. This would be way too costly. But we just generate this patch with a certain dilation factor and translation. And then for each ray on this patch, we can query the color of this radiance field by doing 3D sampling along each ray and querying the radiance field and doing volume rendering in order to obtain this patch. And then we can sample the same patch from a real image and compare these two, which is what our patch discriminator does. And this works remarkably well as a generative model. It produces not only compelling results in terms of appearance, which we were very surprised by, but also very good results in terms of depth. Note that depth is not part of the input of the model. The input of the model is only a set of RGB images, unposed RGB images. So here you can see some interpolations between different shapes and appearances and poses. So the question is, what's next? Well, of course, we want to extend this high-resolution model that can produce single objects to entire 3D scenes, as I've shown in the first part of the presentation. But then we want to also make this model work on real data. Already in 2016, we've proposed a dataset which we termed Kitty 360, which we have never actually released because the project was done with an intern, and so we never really made the dataset come out. You know, the last 10% always take 90% of the time, so it took us significant more steps in order to make this dataset ready. But now we have it ready and we will release it this summer. It's called Kitty 360, a successor of the Kitty dataset. It has 73 kilometers of driving and 2 times for stereo, left and right, 83,000 frames. Actually, it's not slightly incorrect. We have more than 2 cameras. We have also fisheye cameras, so we have full 360-degree view. That's why it's called Kitty 360. We have a laser scanner, a push broom laser scanner that gives a wider field of coverage for the 3D points, and we have fisheye cameras for full 3D 600-degree view. The semantic label, we have semantic labels for all 3D points and for all pixels in the images, and the label definition is consistent with cityscapes. We have 90 classes for evaluation, and we have instance labels for buildings, vehicles, pedestrians, traffic signs, basically for all instance classes. And each instance is assigned with a consistent instance ID across all frames. So everything is really consistent in 3D across this entire dataset. The way we obtain this dataset is by annotating the dataset in 3D using bounding boxes. But in contrast to Kitty, here for Kitty 360, we annotate everything using bounding boxes: the road, the sidewalk, the buildings, the trees, and the vehicles, and so on. This gives us semantic information for all these points that we then fuse in a joint 3D 2D optimization step, and also the instance information, such that they also obtain semantic information in the images. This is an approximate ground truth. It's an inferred ground truth, but it's actually quite precise. And we have this not only for semantics, we have it also for instance, and we can also give an assessment about the confidence at each individual pixel. And of course, we have the original 3D bounding boxes where this dataset was generated from. Now, what I want to show you now is a little cinematic trailer that we have created for this dataset, which I'm going to start now. Okay, so I hope this data set will become useful to the community, in particular for pose estimation, for localization, for visual odometry, for mapping, for simultaneous localization and mapping. Also, when it comes to the object level where semantics and instances are considered, but also for the task of generative modeling, as I was talking about today. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to point you also to this little website that we've created. We have a little blog where we feature new research updates from our group. So if you're interested, I invite you to have a look. Thanks a lot.